Hello and welcome to episode 2 of season 1 of the Race in Society web series, which is focused on race and COVID-19. My name is Alana Lenton and my co-host Zulika Zavalos is behind the scenes this week. We broadcast on our YouTube channel every 2 weeks. Please remember to subscribe to our channel, and that way you'll get all the updates of our upcoming sessions. Okay, so this week we are looking at Indigenous sovereignty and responses to COVID-19 with 3 stellar guests who I'll introduce in a minute. But before I do that, I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Colonization imposed race as a legal, political, and moral force to justify land theft and the exploitation and domination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, according to a white possessive logic, as Professor Moreton-Robinson has taught us. We acknowledge First Nations sovereignty that was never ceded, and that Aboriginal knowledge, practices, and ancestral ownership of land are eternal. So we felt it was crucial to begin our series by thinking about how principles of Indigenous sovereignty, as theorized and practiced by Indigenous scholars and community leaders, can help us to think about the particular challenges being posed by the COVID-19 global health crisis. We have heard racism being referred to analogously as a virus or a pandemic, but that would be to see it as somehow naturally occurring rather than being willfully orchestrated as a key technology of racial-colonial rule. So we are chatting to our panelists today about how their work can help us to critically unpack the logic of race. So first, I'd like to turn to Jill Gallagher. Jill is Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Aboriginal Controlled Community Health Organisation, or Vacho for short. So Jill, Vacho has successfully led proactive health services and advocacy on COVID-19 in Victoria, including culturally safe referrals and practices. So I was wondering if first you could start by telling us about what Indigenous sovereignty means to Vacho and the importance of Aboriginal controlled health organisations, particularly during the COVID-19 crisis. And after that, could you possibly speak to us a little bit about what Vacho sees as the remaining health issues for Aboriginal communities from now until when, hopefully, COVID-19 is eradicated? Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I answer those questions, I'm an Aboriginal woman from Western Victoria. My people are the Gunditjmara people. Just recently, my mob down there in Western Victoria managed to get one of our major landscapes called Budjbim on the World Heritage listing, and that's a big achievement for Aboriginal people on an international platform. So I'd like to acknowledge that. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we are all on Aboriginal lands that was never ceded, and lands that never has treaty over it yet. Sovereignty in the health context is a good example, I suppose, of the social determinants of health. The social determinants of health encompasses not just the clinical view of what health is. It encompasses recognition. It encompasses pride and identity, pride in that we belong to one of the the oldest living culture on the planet. It fosters a sense of self. It fosters growth. Sovereignty was never ceded. So, well, I believe that we still have sovereignty. We just got to bring the rest of the country along with our view. And what that means for us as a peoples. But sovereignty in the health space could mean access to employment opportunities, more than what there has been in the past and currently. And overall, just better health outcomes. I often think about what does empowerment mean in this space, and the effects of racism on one's health and well-being. And I think it was about, I don't know, maybe about 8 years ago, Vic Health did a research project here in Victoria, and they looked at 3 large LGA areas that had high populations of Aboriginal people. And it was researching, does racism still exist? Of course it did. And one of the end results was 98% of the Aboriginal people that were part of that research project experienced racism, and how that impacted on their growth and their life. So sovereignty in the health space can achieve the recognition of sovereignty as sovereign peoples can play a major role in the health and well-being of our people. When you look at, we've been colonised for, what, 230 years? And the ongoing oppression that our people face on a day-to-day level. In the name of colonisation, there were human rights crimes committed in this country against the First Peoples of this country. The stolen generation, you've got to look at all the past policies, the missions that were, the stolen generation, the missions, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I believe that treaties are necessary to implement our sovereignty. I don't think we lost our sovereignty, or was it taken off us, but we need to have treaties to implement our sovereignty. And it's not about pointing the finger at people or laying the blame game in today's society here in Australia. It's about recognising the past. COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the inequality. It actually highlighted the inequality on a global platform. So Aboriginal communities and organisations, they have played, here in Victoria, our oldest Aboriginal health service is about 50 years old. But they have played a vital role in this space, on our landscape, not only in relation to being visible on our landscape, but very earlier on in this pandemic when it first started, one of the biggest challenges for all of us, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, was access to PPE. And what we had to be mindful of, that when they did unplug the blockage, that our organisations had equal access to that PPE. And as we all know, the underlying issues for Aboriginal communities right across this continent, the high risk with the underlying chronic illnesses, living conditions in some areas. We have a lot of homelessness here in Melbourne. And since the pandemic, we've noticed an increase in the Victorian Aboriginal community suicide. And that's quite alarming. And as I was talking earlier, before we actually started, once we get on top of COVID, and we do have a vaccine and we're dealing with it, I believe there's going to be another pandemic, and that's mental health and emotional and spiritual well-being. At the moment here in Melbourne, a lot of our organisations are fatigued. The workforce, not enough of. There is currently the current figures for Victoria in the Victorian Aboriginal community. We have 65 confirmed cases in the Victorian Aboriginal communities. 90% of that 65, they're all ages between 16 and 44. So it is really, really concerning, and the importance of Aboriginal organisations not only in combating and trying to keep the numbers low in the Victorian Aboriginal community, it is about the contact tracing. I mean, the population of Aboriginal people in Victoria, I think the current figures is 58,000 Aboriginal people that live in Victoria. And so we're a minority within the state. And our organisations are so better off placed to know where Uncle Fred went last week, or how to contact Uncle Fred, and he's probably gone up to, gone to the next town. So we know who our mob who are transient. We know how to get hold of them. So that contact tracing, which hasn't been utilised to the best of its ability, lies within the Aboriginal organisations. So coming back to your question, because I've forgotten the question, coming back to your question is basically Aboriginal organisations play a key role in relation to better outcomes for Aboriginal Victorians, in particular during this pandemic. And we need to, if we're not, we're currently here in Melbourne in stage 4 lockdown, and have been now for a couple of weeks, and we've still got a couple of weeks to go. Hopefully it's only a couple of weeks. So the mental health and the not being able to access community is a humongous issue that now the services, the Aboriginal services, can't keep up with the demand around providing the mental health services. So I don't know whether I need to leave it there now. I'm looking for guidance here, and whether I've answered everything or whether you want to come back to me with something that I haven't responded properly.
No, I think you've responded perfectly. And I think what you highlighted, which is so important, is how the current pandemic really throws into relief crises that are ongoing. That's one part of it, but also how organizations like yourselves have always been doing that work. And what really is missed is the amount of resources that are necessary in order to continue doing that work. The example of contact tracing, I think, is extremely important, and those community networks that are so important, and is a sign of how Aboriginal communities have actually through this kind of network and community connections have actually been confronting the pandemic really effectively. But how, as you say, there are going to be ongoing issues that are accentuated by the crisis that we're all living through at the moment. So yeah, thank you so much. I think we'll turn now to distinguished Professor Elena Moreton-Robinson, who at the moment, at the end of a very illustrious career, is Professor of Indigenous Research at RMIT University. And what we'd like you to do, if it's possible, is to explain how you particularly have theorised Indigenous sovereignty in your work, and how your approach might assist us in making sense of the public discussions of race in relation to the coronavirus. So over to you. You need to unmute.
And I'm pausing because I think the question is problematic. And why I say that is that I think that Indigenous sovereignty doesn't come out of the same episteme that we're dealing with the pandemic, for starters. Okay, so in one sense, like Indigenous sovereignty is about being in and of the land. It is fundamentally about relationships with created beings. It's, you know, it's far more complex, I guess, than time will allow me to articulate. But it is not a sovereignty that is born of you know, rights, or it is not a sovereignty that is born through the logic of capital, so it's not a sovereignty that comes out of the Westphalian idea, and it is not a product of the Enlightenment, right? So the way in which we're dealing with the pandemic is fundamentally within those logics of trying to bring order, right? Which is what the whole kind of edifice of knowledge production during the Enlightenment did. It wanted to bring order and of course the body as one of the main things to discipline and govern. Was also the thing that was of concern in the Enlightenment. You know, that is what kind of human is produced through the Enlightenment, is a different kind of human that's produced through the logics of Indigenous sovereignty. So how does that bear out in terms of the pandemic? Becomes, in one sense, you know, our sovereignty has never been ceded, and it can't be ceded, right? Even if you want to develop a treaty, it can't be ceded, because the logics by which it actually is not within the framework of a treaty. Like a treaty actually comes out of that Westphalian notion of contracts, rights, responsibilities. So I guess I'm perplexed about the question in one sense, because I think that, is it really about sovereignty, or is it really fundamentally about the way in which Westphalian sovereignty is actually dealing with the pandemic in a very racial way, right? So if we think about, you know, a raced and gendered wage labour system based on the production of commodities that's enabled by debt, like that's how actually capitalism in the form that we're seeing it now occurs. If we look at it in that way, of course it's logical that the people that are going to be impacted on by the pandemic are the poorest, are the most precarious, right? Because it is a system by which that hierarchy functions. So we shouldn't be surprised that it is people of colour and Indigenous people that are being mostly affected by it. We shouldn't be surprised that it's the police that wants to bring order on those brown and black bodies, you know, because that's part of the way in which the logics operates without a pandemic. What the pandemic does is basically bring a sharper focus to the way in which that inequality is functioning within society. And so I, you know, think to myself that the problematics with what's going on at the moment is with the raced and gendered capitalism that functions within society to produce both an ideological and material context for our lives that takes us down a particular trajectory of, in one sense, suicide for humanity at this point in time. So I'm, you know, the pandemic reminds us, I guess, in a fantastic way, Mother Earth reminds us that we are biological. Mother Earth reminds us that we cannot control everything. You know, this idea that if we just get the vaccine, it's going to be solved, is not really the issue, right? The issue is the kind of life, the kind of cultures that we're in, and the materialist production that has occurred that produces the viruses like COVID are things that operate through a particular logic that are not about understanding that we are, as humans, no more important than any other living thing, right? So it comes out of a logic where humans are at the top. Humans exploit the earth, and so when I talk about sovereignty, that is not the way that Indigenous people see our relationship with Mother Earth. We are, and when I say we are in and of the earth, our sovereignty is in and of the earth. The Westphalian notion is that ontologically, sovereignty is conferred by an extraterrestrial being who lives by the name of God. Yes? So, and that notion of Westphalian sovereignty comes out of Britain. So the other kind of thing that I guess that I'm trying to think through some of this stuff in terms of the work that I'm doing now about race, like what a lot of the race theories are saying about the emergence of race through the Enlightenment. And I would agree that it emerges as a biological entity, which then has a whole heap of disciplinary knowledges built around to create racial science. But if we look prior to that, not seeing, as Foucault argues, as a linguistic marker, or as others have argued, as it's a colorism, if we actually start to think through the logics of it's really, to me, about the way in which blackness actually becomes biologized through the Enlightenment. That's what occurs. And if we want to think about, in terms of Christian doctrines, the religious stuff, we can see that, let's go back to the Greeks, that, blackness is always associated with evil, with badness. Whiteness is always purity. If you're white, you're right. So when I listen to Jill, what I can see is that, Aboriginal health organisations have been at the forefront of protecting this forest, and they acted really quickly. And fundamentally, they did that because of our history of poor health. But did they do that with added resources? No. Right? So, but they did it because they knew they had to move to protect. And like I said, I'm not, one could have even predicted a whole heap of things in terms of race as to what's actually occurred. You could have predicted the police would move into more surveillance, more heavy-handedness on brown and black bodies. You could have predicted that, white people that got off a cruise ship would not actually be exposed publicly, the way in which the African girls were in Brisbane. Like, it's the racial logics at play are predictable. And that's the sad fact about what's occurred. And Australia still, refuses to own the fact that race is absolutely fundamental to the way in which this society operates. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the way in which you brought those, the question and your talking back to the question is really useful for thinking about the incommensurability, really, of Indigenous sovereignty with racial logics, which is kind of at the heart of the problem that you're pointing out there in your conclusion to your answer. And I like the dialogue between yourself and Jill, coming from your position as a more kind of in race theory, and Jill's position more in terms of work on the ground. So it's a really interesting, I think it's an interesting opportunity to have that conversation. And now, Debbie Bargali, I think your work also speaks to this and is kind of more practically focused in a way, because in your recent book, Unmasking the Racial Contract, Indigenous Voices on Racism in the Australian Public Service, you document how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices and expertise have been routinely silenced in your case, in your research, in federal government. So first, could you explain to us what you mean by the concept of the racial contract as you use it in your work? And once you've done that, might you answer how might breaking this contract potentially boost public health responses to the pandemic, through Indigenous inclusion, if that's the right word for it, in decision making, or perhaps Indigenous autonomy in decision making?
Okay, so I'm a Kamilaroi Wanneroo woman from northwest New South Wales. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm living and working on the unceded land of the Quandamooka peoples in southeastern Queensland, and pay my respect to elders past and present. So to answer your first question, the racial contract is a theory developed by Charles Mills, a Jamaican philosopher. It's a conceptual and abstract way of thinking. The racial contract is an invisible contract between those who are categorised as white over non-white, or in the Australian context, non-Indigenous over Indigenous. The purpose of the contract, or the racial contract, is to maintain the status quo. So not only does it privilege and advantage whites, but it's run by whites for the benefits of white people. So my research unmasks the racial contract operationalised in the Australian Public Service, exposing the business as usual racisms and the masquerade of meritocracy that, I'm saying, bolsters lots and cements white advantage. The racial contract frames the operations of the APS, and it's maintained primarily through everyday and structural racism. And as a critical race theory, the racial contract centres race as a way of examining that white racial privilege and black racial disadvantage. So while not all non-Indigenous peoples may be signatories to that contract, all non-Indigenous peoples employees benefit from it. And Indigenous employees were never intended to be signatories on that contract in the first place. So the racial contract supported in the APS by legislations, codes of conducts, various acts, policies, practices and procedures. And what came through in my research that examined the experiences of Indigenous employees in the APS is that racism is everyday and in every way, and that is individual and it's structural, it's systemic. And these forms of racism go hand in hand and need to be managed that way as well. However, this is not done in the APS, and there's been little to no acknowledgement that racism actually exists in the public service, and claims of racism are often met with denial by those in public service. And this is not surprising, considering that denial is the key feature of racism in Australia and a crucial feature for maintaining it. So looking at answering the second part of your question, Indigenous employees make up only about 1.2% of the public sector's senior Indigenous senior service workforce, while most Indigenous employees languish on the lower rungs of the APS employment ladder. So that begs the question of actually, who is writing Indigenous policy, who is developing Indigenous programs, who is managing and directing Indigenous program funding, and who's actually overseeing this work. And the answer is that it's mostly non-Indigenous people with little accountability to Indigenous communities working across a variety of departments. And this is in an institution where racism is seen as an aberration, where Indigenous employees are placed in token positions that are largely and often largely marginalised or ignored or excluded from decision-making processes. An institution where Indigenous peoples are viewed as needing to be fixed, and deficit thinking is applied to Indigenous policy programs and employees. It's also an institution where it's demonstrated that policymakers fail to engage with researchers and fail to implement findings from the evidence of reports and inquiries, along with the failure to examine failed policies and programs. It's an environment where Indigenous policy is watered down or made so rigid to the point where it's often rendered useless. And racist silence and complicity are often to blame. And I argue that it will take more than a critical mass of Indigenous employees and the appointment of an Aboriginal Indigenous Affairs Minister to overcome the entrenched structural white supremacy, as long as Indigenous employees, enter the APS under restrictive terms of inclusion. So the notion of a racial contract is that it can be broken. Indigenous progression requires a tearing up of the APS racial contract, and simply changing the racial contract is not enough to change the dominant racial order in the APS, where whiteness as a system of power is defended and reinforced every day through various mechanisms. And I understand that the Australian government has been working in conjunction with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to develop and implement, tailored, culturally appropriate, evidence-based responses to COVID-19. But why does it take a crisis for government to operate this way? The strength of Indigenous health sector and the innovative Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health leadership has proven to have the best ability to provide advice and direction on the response. And Indigenous peoples, have been seeking their own solutions to this pandemic, and as has already been noted, with limited resources. They are taking action and employing tried and tested public health policy methods, demonstrating the importance of self-determination and also demonstrating the significant role that Indigenous Australian peoples play in public health. So the responses to COVID-19 to date, understandably, have primarily focused on keeping Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people safe, but the widespread social and economic marginalisation remains that amplify the impacts of Indigenous Australian peoples as compared to, the general population. So the mantra is, we're all in this together. And this may be true in that the virus doesn't discriminate in terms of who it infects, but Indigenous Australian peoples may disproportionately be impacted in the long run. And as Australian governments move to lift restrictions, people have been urged to work from home if they can. But for many Indigenous peoples, this is often, out of reach. Indigenous peoples who work in the service industry or in labour industry and so forth are, more likely to be Indigenous peoples. And in terms of the future of work, many Indigenous peoples, particularly those of us in later stages of life, later stages of working life, may never, return to work again. There's already a wide employment gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Also, many Indigenous peoples are the first in family to have had the opportunity to develop careers or have started them later in life. Many have not had the same opportunities to build superannuation, and the majority do not build intergenerational wealth through inheritance in the same way that many, non-Indigenous peoples do. So we may all be in this together, but I guarantee at the end we won't come all out together. What is policy post-COVID-19 going to do to address the impact that it has on Indigenous peoples and their families and communities? Indigenous Australian leadership and community members have led the way and have taken action to manage the prevention of this pandemic spreading to Indigenous peoples and communities. But just imagine how much more could be achieved towards closing the gap if the public service invested in robust, anti-racist, Indigenous-led and Indigenous-centred policy making and program development and management strategies across all public service departments through a critical race lens informed by critical Indigenous-led research that centres race and examines racism. So a structural change is necessary, and this will require non-Indigenous leaders to relinquish their automatic right to power and control and adopt principles of solidarity to work with us and a commitment to Indigenous self-determination. And with that being said, I don't envisage a mass exodus from the racial contract anytime soon.
Yes, thank you, Debbie. I mean, I think that kind of brings together a lot of the issues, but also aspirations for what could be otherwise, and what I guess you're working towards, all of you are working towards, albeit in a situation of kind of being realistic about what the challenges are. And I think what we wanted to do was, once you'd answered these more general questions, is think together for a moment about this kind of ongoing crisis and what's really being amplified throughout this this pandemic that we're all living through, as I said before, is how it accentuates the ongoing crisis. And what, of course, has accompanied this moment is this explosion onto the scene of global Black Lives Matter protests in reaction to the murder, the police killing of George Floyd in the United States, but really being amplified throughout the world and thrown into relief, I think, against the backdrop of the pandemic and the crisis, as we've been saying, that it accentuates. And the protests here in this country were organized mainly by Aboriginal women. And I think because we have 3 Aboriginal women here today, it's really interesting to ask you to comment on this. And the purposes of these protests was to shed light, particularly on Black deaths in custody, which is an ongoing tragedy. And given the timing of these protests, as I've said, at the height of the pandemic, why do you think it's important to understand racial justice as a public health matter also, thinking also about the way in which the protests were wrongly blamed for the spread of the virus? And how, secondly, do you think that Aboriginal women's organising in relation to this relate to the ongoing questions of survival and sovereignty? So we might ask Jill first, and then Aileen, and then Debbie, and then we'll conclude. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a very, very powerful question, and there's a lot in there. Here in Melbourne, when the rally was being organised, the Black Lives Matter rally, here in Melbourne, it was organised by the majority of young Aboriginal women. There was a lot of uproar within the government about it. There was a lot of uproar in the media about it. Vacho, as a peak health organisation, was put under pressure to come out publicly and denounce the rally and blah, 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 blah. Now, as an Aboriginal woman, I could not do that. And I knew that the rally was going to happen no matter what I said or what I did. And it's unfortunate about the timing, but when you look at what sparked that bushfire, we had no influence over the timing. It wasn't our doing, the timing, and that's how a lot of Aboriginal people in Victoria saw it. Now, there were health concerns because it was in the middle of a world pandemic. And so Vacho acted very quickly to at least to secure PPE. We knew it was going to be a big rally. And we knew that it was going to go ahead. So we wanted to approach it from a harm minimisation approach. Sanitizer, a lot of masks, and we opened up our garage in the offices of Vacho in Collingwood a couple of days before the march was scheduled to take place. And we advertised to all who were planning to attend to come and get your PPE, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And we got and one of our major Aboriginal health services here in Victoria, the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service, also came on board to, they set up a stall at the march where people could go to their store and get PPE. So the messaging was still there, yeah, it was going to go ahead. And as for the timing, yes, it wasn't ideal, but Aboriginal, well, from the people who organised it here in Melbourne, I had many conversations about, I mean, I as an Aboriginal woman understand, any Aboriginal person would understand, but what happened with George Floyd, as I said earlier, it sparked a build-up of 230 years of we've had enough crap. You know, when you look at the figures in this country of the First Peoples, when you look at the justice figures, you look at the incarceration figures, you look at the homeless figures, you look at the suicide figures, you look at the employment figures, you look at the wealth and economic growth figures. That tells a story in itself. You look at the deaths in custody here in Australia. It's not just an overseas thing. That tells a story in itself. So, and the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter rally here in Melbourne, we had very high-profile mainstream media try tie back. You remember when the towers were locked down here in Melbourne? High-rise flats. I think it was the Age that actually portrayed that all the new COVID cases came from that rally. That was not true. That was unfounded. To date, there has been no case of COVID in this state that's been linked back to that rally. I think I might just leave my comments. I mean, I do want to make a couple of comments here in Victoria in relation to the deaths in custody. I don't know how long ago, I think it was back in the 80s or maybe late 70s, there was a inquiry into Aboriginal deaths in custody. There was a very good recommendations that still need to be implemented. So at the moment, a lot of Aboriginal organisations like our Aboriginal Legal Services here in Victoria, they're running, working with government to do simple things like decriminalise public drunkenness. When I was the Treaty Commissioner last year, I visited every prison in Victoria to consult with Aboriginal people in prisons. And some of the inspirational stories when I asked Aboriginal prisoner inmates what's their aspirations for sovereignty and treaty, it was just made you cry. And when you look at the crimes that our people are incarcerated for, the majority of the crimes. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Elena?
Still haven't got down pat this technology. Okay, so Elena, can you just repeat those two questions, please?
Yeah, I mean, the question really is thinking about the timing of the protests during the pandemic, why it's important to understand racial justice also as a public health matter. So I guess linking the protests and the pandemic together. And then the second question is really about Aboriginal women's organising and how that specifically relates to survival and the theme of sovereignty.
Okay, I'm going to start. Okay, so I guess what I want to do is just honour the women who were crucial to organising that protest, young women. You know, most of them belong to warriors of the Aboriginal resistance wars, of which my grandniece, so my family has a direct interest. We're involved in that. Gurrumpul people, you know, we've never ceded our sovereignty. We position ourselves in terms of our sovereignty. I think that you know, as Jill's saying, like, what you actually saw was Aboriginal people exercising their sovereignty on the streets. Right, so it wasn't really, you know, an issue in the sense, an issue in the sense that they weren't going to do it. Of course they were going to do it because they had to seize the moment to shine the spotlight on the deaths in custody here, because we can't get traction in terms of really the deaths in custody here. I might just add, I worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in Queensland and was fired from it. That is a discussion for another day. And did do research into prisons here for the Incarcerated People's Cultural Heritage Program, which was set up by Dennis Walker. So the deaths in custody, as Jill's saying, is that the implementation of the recommendations hasn't occurred. And there is like one simple thing that the federal government could do, and it would change things tomorrow. And that is to basically allow Aboriginal prisoners to have a Medicare card so that the Aboriginal medical services can go into the prisons to service it. Like that. Easy fix, like that, right? One thing that they can do, because we know the majority of the deaths in custody are from disregard, neglect, a la racism, but they're medical conditions. A lot of them fundamentally could have been prevented had they had service to, had they, you know, because this is like how twisted the whole system is. We did some research last year into the coroner's reports into Queensland, and I was really concerned about, the question for me was, did the coroners themselves ask for the health history of the people who died? And fundamentally, because the prison didn't have the history, there was really no report on the prisoner's health, right? Because when people go into prison, it's like their tubular rasa, right? So they just go in and then everything has to be set up. So even the stuff around my health is not a part of the prison system. So you can't just, you know, as a prisoner goes in, go, oh, this is the health record. And the question, and then that becomes, why is this so? Right? Why is this so? And given that, you know, we the amount of Aboriginal people that are incarcerated, of course, it's our population that's going to suffer most from the ineptness of that policy or lack of policy implementation. I mean, it is, and it seems to me that we're, Black Lives Matter really started back with Rodney King in the 1990s, which also gave impetus to what occurred here in Australia. So Black Lives Matter has been around for quite some time. What we didn't have, though, in the 1990s, which we have now, of course, is social media and the ability to bear witness, right? So phones allow us to bear witness in ways in which we didn't have before. So the atrocities now are far more public. Which means that, you know, non-Indigenous people, for the first time, I guess, really get to see our reality when we can capture it on phone. Therefore, people moved, I think, in support of the deaths in custody. Whether or not that shifts things beyond the pandemic is another question. I think that, again, it will probably be Aboriginal women leadership. And, you know, and Jill would know this, you know, when you've worked in Aboriginal medical services and, you know, my time, I guess, like her time, I was sort of the beginning of those services coming into being, right? And they certainly at that point in time were not a fourth tier of government, which I would argue they are now, right? The degree of control of our organisations by government and the incorporation into the state apparatus is unimaginable when you're sitting and looking in the 1970s when you're setting them up, you know, thinking that this is actually going to be the conduit for self-determination, right? And then to see that self-determination be cut and grounded down by incorporation more and more through administrative surveillance and accountability to the state. You know, I would argue that our, you know, and I've talked with Foley about this, is that the way in which we as a political movement became stifled was because of the threats of government to shut us down if we didn't behave by withholding money. So services couldn't be provided, right? So you coerced the organisations into behaving And, you know, in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, those organisations provided the resources for us to mobilise, to get to Canberra, to get to the demonstrations, you know. And so to see Black Lives Matter move, and then to see the Aboriginal Medical Services support that, to me was so heartening, because, and that women led it. And women have been at the forefront of organising always, right? But we have had to put men up in front because patriarchy requires that, right? So in like, you know, and I'll give you an example. Like I wrote a paper for FAIRA in the year of Indigenous peoples about the position of Indigenous women in Australia, but we had to get a man to actually present it. You know, the way in which patriarchy wants to only see other males on the other side means most of the time that Aboriginal women's work is invisible and not valued, you know, in the same way as Aboriginal men who are perceived to be our leaders. And like I come, like the Gurunpul people have like we walk with our men. Here we had our own business, our own women's business. So to grow up in a country where, you know, my uncle wouldn't walk, if he saw Aboriginal women talking, he would never just walk into that meeting to see. He would wait to be invited. The same as a woman wouldn't walk straight into a men's meeting, right? So there were those kind of gender relations of respect and mutuality, also acknowledged the importance of both men and women to decision making in our societies. But patriarchy comes in and starts to, you know, break those systems by refusing to listen to women because of their own misogynistic and sexist behaviour towards their own women. And I think that we, you know, Aboriginal women in the movement, you know, you don't hear the names. You only hear the names of the women that you see on the television or up front, but you don't hear the names of the women who are in there that do the 24/7. You know, they're the real heroes in our communities. They're the mothers, they're the aunties, the grannies, you know, and, you know, so when I saw those young women mobilising to put Black Lives Matter in protest visibly, my heart was full, you know, because I just thought, there they are, the sovereign warrior women doing the good work. And because that work, it is never ending and it is continuing, and it will continue for a couple of centuries if we exist that long as humans. So I don't know if that's answered the question, but yep.
It has, more than amply. Thank you. Debbie.
Well, how do I follow that? So I guess as history sort of showed us, Indigenous resistance has been a 230-year journey of solidarity and survival. And Aboriginal people have, as history has shown us, that continually protested for racial justice, and any advancements that we've got has been through Aboriginal-led protest. So the Aboriginal-led Black Lives Matter campaigns and protests, you know, are a continuation of this ongoing struggle, you know, and survival of colonisation. And in thinking about, you know, the Aboriginal women leading this, you know, these women leading the Aboriginal, you know, Black Lives Matter movement here from, you know, in protest of, you know, institutional racism, and it's against the deaths, you know, in custody of their, you know, their sons, their daughters, their mothers, their fathers, brothers, sisters, aunties and uncles and cousins. And, you know, in terms of timing, you know, no time is ever considered by government or much of mainstream Australia to be the right time for, you know, Indigenous Australian peoples to be seen visibly on the streets challenging the state. And, you know, as Jill mentioned earlier, you know, Aboriginal peoples did everything they can, and we saw that to ensure, you know, public safety, and that was public safety for everybody that could attend. And, you know, as Prof mentioned also, you know, these are responses to, you know, the failure to implement the, you know, Royal Commission findings, you know, Aboriginal deaths in custody findings, you know, 20 years or so later. So, you know, racism is a matter of life and death, and, you know, in my opinion, you know, the protests must go on. End of story.
Thank you. And as somebody who, I've been doing a legal observer at most of the protests that have happened in Sydney since June, and I can attest to the fact that they're probably the most safely organized, you know, meeting together of people. I think 99.9% of people were wearing masks, and volunteers were going around handing out hand sanitizer every 5 minutes, and certainly much more safe. I felt much more safe there among that crowd than I do if I have to go shopping. But what was clear was that the police was there for a fight and was trying its very best to turn it violent, to make it something that was going to hit the headlines, and to cast the blame again on Aboriginal people and people of colour for being responsible for the spread of the pandemic. And I think that's absolutely shameful. And as Jill said, it's been borne out. The evidence is there that no instance of the virus is spread or can be linked back to any of the protests. And I think the protests need to go on. On that note, I'd like to thank all three of you so much for honouring us by sharing your wisdom with us today. I think it's, for me at least, it's been really, really, I've learned a lot from engaging with you and listening to you. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in, and to remind you please to like our channel and to subscribe so that you get updates of our subsequent episodes. Our next episode, which will be broadcast in 2 weeks' time, is going to look at media representations of race and the COVID-19 pandemic. And our three guests will be Christopher Ralla-Baker, who is the chair of the Indigenous Doctors Association, and researchers Summer May Finlay and Karen Schamberger. So thank you all, and thanks for tuning in to Race in Society.